And when perhaps you've got ADHD and attention and listening is really difficult for you, then that means that your risks go up slightly. And as all these things start coming together, all the risks are stacking up. And it's a really sad indictment, really, of the fact that some people have had really tough times growing up.
Hello, and welcome to Locked Up Living, the podcast which looks at resilience in challenging organisations, such as, but not only, prisons and hospitals for mentally ill prisoners and patients. My name is David Jones, and together with Naomi Murphy, I present your Locked Up Living podcast.
So today we welcome along Jacqui Learoyd, who's a speech and language therapist at HMP Berwyn. Hidden within the prison walls are people with various needs which are a risk to their health and well-being. Jacqui works across all ages from 18 to the end of life, trying to support the communication needs of this marginalised group at all stages of their prison sentence. She has specific interests in de-escalating tense situations via communication, supporting competence in social communication, and helping everyone understand that just because a person can talk doesn't mean that they're skilled in understanding and expression, as we might demonstrate during the interview. Welcome, Jacqui.
Thank you for having me.
Hello there, Jacqui.
Hi, David.
Hi, good to meet you. So, Jacqui, I've actually worked with a speech and language therapist before when I was working at Gartree Prison at the TC Plus, which is the therapeutic community for prisoners with learning difficulties. So I worked alongside speech and language therapists for about 5 years there. But for those of our listeners who haven't encountered one, what is a speech and language therapist? What kind of interventions would a speech and language therapist, what would they see as being the bread and butter part of their role?
Well, this is a very good question. It's something I'm really passionate about because I think that there aren't many people in the general population that knows what a speech and language therapist does. So I should probably get in there right away by saying we don't do elocution. So don't expect me to talk today in perfectly pronounced Queen's English because we're not elocutionists. So as a profession, we're very, very broad. So we work with people from the moment they're born until the moment they die, in a range of different ways. So it could do with communication, but it also can do with the way that a person is able to swallow. I'm going to park the swallowing slightly for this conversation because it's kind of outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But in respect of communication development, when we can work with children who aren't developing language, who are maybe non-verbal, we can work with people that have got conditions such as cleft palate that is affecting their ability to develop speech. As they go on through their life course, there's various different conditions that may or may not come along that impact on a person. So when you think of speech and language therapy traditionally in the paediatric setting, it might be helping the person engage with school and learning and understanding and expressing. And then as people get older, it maybe moves into things like their social skills and their ability to advocate for themselves and assert themselves appropriately. And then as people get older again and they acquire things like head injuries, then that plays a part. Anything that affects your brain will affect your ability to process language and use it effectively. So then you have acquired conditions as you get older, such as stroke or head injury or motor neuron disease. So there's a range of places where you will find speech and language therapists.
Thank you. Is it a very old profession?
Well, so going back hundreds of years, there is recorded evidence of people that are good communicators working with people that have got a problem, but it's only become a more formal profession in the last 100 years, and it attracted the Royal Charter. So I'm a member of the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. And it attracted that after the speech and language therapy needs of the late King.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed. So can you tell us something about your own career trajectory and how you came to be working with people in contact with the criminal justice system particularly?
Yeah, definitely. So I trained to be a speech and language therapist because I really like people and I really like an excuse to sit and talk to someone, and to listen to them and engage. So I feel really strongly about that. And I came to speech therapy not intending specifically to work with children, but being much more interested in supporting adults to reach their best potential. So when I graduated from speech and language therapy, I actually worked in just an ordinary hospital, with people that had had a stroke or people that had got brain tumours. And so for some of them, I was trying to rehabilitate function, so using a medical model and being very sort of based in neurological repair. So with things such as stroke. And for some people, it was managing deterioration. So when you've got conditions such as dementia, trying to support relationships as the person is going to deteriorate over a number of weeks or months, and trying to maintain communication at the end of life, because that's so important. And so I did that for a really long time. And then I got to the stage where I fancied a change in terms of moving away from managing deterioration and the deteriorating patient. And I wanted a scenario where there would be less end of life care. And I saw a job advertised at a secure setting to set up a speech and language therapy service from scratch for people with learning disability and autistic spectrum conditions that had been convicted of an offence and were being looked after in a secure setting. So I had a radical change from a hospital ward into a locked hospital, and just loved it. I was just, it was such a pleasure to move more into sort of psychologically informed care and to think about people as whole people rather than their component parts, and to just sort of engage in a range of meaningful ways with them. And it was just wonderful. So I really enjoyed that. And then conveniently, about 5 years ago, it was prior to 5 years ago, they started building it, but getting on for 5 years ago, they decided to open the UK's largest prison within striking distance of where I live. And they advertised for somebody to go and organise a speech and language therapy service for them. And so I jumped at the chance, and so now I've gone from a secure unit with 12 beds to a prison with 2,000 beds. So I get to spend even more time just indulging myself in the speech and language and communication needs of those people.
That's very impressive. You're talking about HMP Berwyn, aren't you? Which is in my terms, a fairly new prison, and I've never been there. It sounds very interesting. And presumably you're working with a team, not just yourself. Is that right?
So we've got an integrated healthcare team. So we are trying to offer. It's more like, you should imagine it like a GP surgery that's been put in the middle of a prison. So rather than thinking of it as just a couple of rooms somewhere, think of it as an entire primary care centre that you might have in your hometown, but located within a prison. So within that, we offer a range of services. So in total, we've got about 120 members of NHS staff working there, covering all different issues, primary care needs, mental health needs, clinical psychology needs, physical health things. We've got, a complete raft of professionals working there. And so I'm located within the therapies team, which includes myself and a colleague who's another speech therapist, but also a dietitian, audiology, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, podiatry. The list goes on. So I'm not alone, but I am the primary speech and language therapist.
That seems pretty forward-thinking, actually, to employ a speech and language therapist. I mean, you expect to find them in teams for people with intellectual disabilities, so a TC plus doesn't seem that strange. But within a population which isn't classified as having intellectual disability, it seems very forward-thinking. And I wondered, was that led by the prison, or was that led by the trust that were bringing this service in and saying this is what you really need to have? It seems so innovative.
It's really led by the fact that that HMP Berwyn was designed to try and do something a bit different. So the problem, with the criminal justice system in the UK is the reoffending rate and the number of people that are incarcerated, and whether or not incarceration works. In the project phase, the thought around HMP Berwyn was to look much more at the actual needs of the people that would be located there, and then compare that with a much less punitive approach that happens in Scandinavia, and to try and create something that would have a foot in both camps and try and reduce reoffending rates and make a difference. So that's the ethos. It's very much a rehabilitative culture, and so the thought of trying to nurture people with their health and well-being just fits with that, doesn't it? It's just logical that the two things go together. And so speech and language therapy sits with that portfolio. There isn't a huge amount of evidence base around the communication needs of adult prisoners, but there's quite a lot around young offenders. And so when you meet adult prisoners and they start telling you their stories and you realise they've come from young offenders, it kind of is a no-brainer that the issues that were identified by colleagues during the young offender research that has happened will just continue into adulthood, but will probably become even more so because in the interim, those people have acquired more head injuries, they've taken more substances, they've had all sorts of other experiences that perhaps have changed and worsened their skills.
That's very interesting. In a way, you're describing really the kind of career of these young people you meet and work with in young offenders in institutes, and then meeting them later in the prison, which of course is a very sad tale, really, isn't it? So how has it sounds as if you're embedded in a very positive multidisciplinary team, and that you really enjoy that work. And I was wondering, how exactly do you explain your work to colleagues? And I'm thinking here of both your multidisciplinary team colleagues and the operational staff.
This is a very good question. So when I started, there were a lot of colleagues, particularly operational staff, who just couldn't really see why I would be employed. Like they kind of felt I was a bit of a flight of fancy of somebody at project phase to sort of, bring in a speech and language therapist as just a little icing on top of the cake, but that it not really being worth very much. And I've worked so hard in the past nearly 5 years to try and educate my colleagues and to work with them and to create a speech and language therapy service that has an open access so that anyone can access it. So I link with people who are subject to a lot of use of force, and so I'll link with the person who's been restrained as well as the people doing the restraining to find out if there was a communication breakdown and if something could have been different there. I work with people who perhaps are presenting with a lot of self-harming behaviours and look at ways that whether the self-harming behaviours are an act of communication and how we can understand that and do differently, and kind of positive behaviour support plans around some of the more challenging people. And I'm hoping, I mean, this is slightly me blowing my own trumpet, but I'm hoping I've proved my worth and that Because now when there's a person that someone is struggling with, they come to me really readily and say, can you come to a meeting about this person, and can we talk about how we might tweak something that feels quite small but actually would be massive in terms of trying to help that communication flow happen and help the person express their needs and help the operational staff exchange a message that works. So, sitting and explaining to a person about how just because you and I can understand long, complex sentences and unpack the grammar of that and understand complex vocabulary and know what an idiom is and how to manage it, doesn't mean that the gentlemen that we're working with have all those skills. And some of the people that I meet, they can only manage 2 pieces of information in basic vocabulary, and then they need a little bit of thinking time. So even just supporting with a bit of processing time is going to make a massive difference to how that communication happens, and to keeping everyone kind of on the same page as working towards an outcome that perhaps is much calmer.
Because it sounds as if you're often working with things which might go unseen or unnoticed to the outside observer, may not always be fully aware in the individual themselves. Is that about right?
Completely the case. So most of the people I work with have never met a speech and language therapist before. I'm not even sure if they were in the room now and you asked them what I do, whether they'd be able to tell you what I do. So many of them are people that have perhaps grown up in tough situations. They perhaps fell out of school. They perhaps got involved in all sorts of situations when they were teenagers. And these kind of people that have had these experiences of life, they haven't attended regular appointments, and they haven't been seen by the school Senko, and they haven't had somebody take them to some review appointment somewhere. So they have fallen through the cracks completely. But all of those undiagnosed needs that they present with are the things that mean that they're all those little chances are being stacked against them at each stage in their life course. So when you're in school and you have a developmental language disability, that is going to mean that you're going to struggle a bit more in school, and the risk of you being excluded from school goes up. And when perhaps you've got ADHD and attention and listening is really difficult for you, then that means that your risks go up slightly. And as all these things start coming together, all the risks are stacking up. And it's a really sad indictment, really, of the fact that some people have had really tough times growing up.
So it sounds as if many people with the kind of difficulties that you're describing may spend their lives trying to disguise those issues, and may feel threatened and exposed and humiliated if people draw attention to them. Does that crop up in your work?
Completely. So spending time with me is completely voluntary for any of the people that reside at the prison. So if I've annoyed them or if I'm unhelpful, they can bin me off, and I really don't mind if that's how they feel about the work I've done. That's really clear feedback that I'm doing something wrong. So the other thing is that I don't work in blocks of therapy like you might find in a traditional speech therapy service. So I wouldn't expect to meet a person and see them 6 times and discharge them. I might work with a person for many years, however long they're going to be residing with us. And I am very, very conscious that these are people who have had to be quite tough. They've grown up in really tough stuff. And so they're not going to come in and expose any vulnerabilities to me. And I'm going to have to talk to them about any vulnerabilities in a really sensitive way, because I don't want to dismantle their self-esteem. And you have to be quite cautious about how you tell somebody about some of their difficulties, because they don't want to feel that exposed. And I'm also super duper aware that in prison you can't look vulnerable, because that places you in additional risks of somebody trying to manipulate that scenario. So I always talk to them about how they wear a suit of armour and how they need to wear their suit of armour in prison because that's something that keeps them safe. It's a protective factor. But there are things that we couldn't do that don't take away from their suit of armour that perhaps mean that that things are a little better. So even if it's just them making a mental note of a time when something's gone wrong so that they can tell me about it the following few days and I can explain what happened, and then they understand it and will be able to manage it better next time, that is a really sensitive way of managing, say, a person that doesn't have a social competence with interactions and has poor theory of mind to know what the other person's intention was, and perhaps has really low mood and feels that everybody dislikes them. So sitting with them, if they can save and hold on to that little nugget of something that's bothering them, and then we can sit down together and we can draw it out on a piece of paper like a cartoon strip and put in everyone's thinking bubbles and really spend a little bit of time having a guided reflection on the scenario, then they just have a light bulb moment and kind of go, oh yes, that was the thing. And perhaps after we've done that repeatedly over many months, the person then starts to feel a little bit more confident to say to a trusted officer, I'm having a problem with this thing. So it's very small gains that we're hoping to achieve over a really long period to take a person from perhaps not doing very well to perhaps doing something a little better. And when they say to me, oh, something bad happened, but I walked away from something that could have escalated, then that's me sorted for the day. That's all of my happy outcomes in one go. I'm working with a young man at the moment who can be really quite feisty and damage property and hurt people, and he came to see me and said that he was having a problem with an officer. He felt that the two of them weren't understanding each other well, so he'd asked for mediation. And although I had to look really calm and cool in that moment and sort of just take that as just like, yes, that's fine. Inside, I'm doing cartwheels because, we're obviously achieving what we wanted to set out to achieve if we've gone from asking for mediation as a solution to a problem. So it's pleasant.
That sounds like a fantastic outcome. And I was really struck when you were talking, Jacqui, about the kind of adaptations it sounds like you have to make quite similar for other forms of talking therapists within the prison service, that we know that with some people it might take up to a year to build up a relationship where you actually get them to feel safe enough to trust you with their narrative of their life, really. And it sounds like you're making those adaptations yourself. But I was left wondering, how do you end up with referrals to your service? Because if some of these are masked needs, there are also things that people perhaps don't want to flag up, that they have difficulties. No one likes to flag up a deficit, do they? How do referrals or potential referrals come to your attention?
So we have a completely open referral system, so anybody can refer. That includes the people themselves referring, and we aim to see a person quite quickly, so that quite soon after referral the person can start to develop relationships. We do have men that self-refer, and partially that's because their friend will say to them, oh, I've had some help around a similar thing that you've got a problem with. You should maybe have a chat with Jacqui, and that is also something that's really pleasing. Usually they're really cautious about telling each other which services they're engaging with, but because speech therapy seems so much of an enigma and they don't really know what they're doing themselves when they're doing it. It doesn't have that stigma attached to it, like, oh yeah, I've just seen my substance misuse worker or whatever. So they'll happily sort of say, oh, you've seen Jacqui as well. Yeah, I have a chat with her sometimes, and it's quite sort of accepted. So men can refer themselves, and they do. I had one chap who wrote me a letter about his pad mate who he was worried about, and so I engineered having a little chat with the pad mate and trying to find out what was happening there. I get a lot of referrals from the offender managers. I get referrals from the college, so from the education setting we have, from my healthcare colleagues, from the forensic psychology team, across the board. We don't have a problem attracting referrals, and they're mostly appropriate. The inclusion criteria for the service is that if you're not sure about something with somebody and you feel like they're struggling, then let us have a little look. The thing we exclude is people who have got bereavement issues, because if we started running a bereavement service under the umbrella of speech and language therapy, we would be swamped. So we don't do bereavement. And trauma, we try and leave that with the clinical psychology team. Although when you've got a person who's got speech and language therapy needs and trauma needs, sometimes they need a foot in both camps. So we work closely together to try and sometimes help with that scenario.
That's helpful, thank you. Jacqui, why do you think speech, language and communication needs are so common amongst people who are in contact with the criminal justice system?
Well, I mean, this is a huge question, isn't it? I think there's definitely the life course stuff. So when you think about people that end up within a prison, they're nearly sort of self-selected through lots and lots of small choices that have happened throughout their life course. So when they were young and they were struggling in school, or when they disengaged and perhaps went to a pupil behaviour unit, or were expelled, and at all those different points, there's a crossroads, isn't there? And you can choose to go one way or another. And there seems to be a set of crossroads and a set of choices that people make that they end up incarcerated, and that perhaps choices would have been different if they'd have had better skills at understanding what was happening and what was asked of them and why, and better social relationships, and be better able to express themselves. So many examples of people that have maybe become violent in the classroom because they couldn't explain what it was that was hard for them. And so it's not that they're not bright, and it's not that they're not, people that are really able and had huge potential to do amazing things. It's just that all those small decisions add up, and your understanding of yourself and how you feel about yourself also impacts on the narratives you create for yourself. So if you're starting to feel like you're a bad person and that you're naughty, you might create a narrative that fits with that, and that's your sense of identity. And even how we kind of process our own narratives about ourselves has something to do with speech and language therapy, and about how you would describe yourself, and whether I mean, I'm working with a chap at the moment who I think he's just a lovely man, but every time I meet him he tells me what a bad person he is and how he's a really bad man, and he's really scary and dangerous in his narrative. And my account of him is really different, and it, to me, that's an interesting reflection point, because that's where he's located his identity, and that labelling that's been given to him through his entire life course, and how that's been acquired, and therefore that's part of that self-fulfilling prophecy stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, and I was also thinking about, I know the service that I've worked in for nearly 2 decades, that I think around 85% of the men had identified themselves as experiencing emotional neglect during, or they hadn't identified that, the therapist working with them had identified them as experiencing emotional neglect during childhood. And of course what that can mean is that people have pretty impoverished relationships, don't they? And our speech and communication skills presumably really flourish when we have good social interactions.
Yeah, it's all so tightly embedded. There's such a huge overlap with this way of thinking about speech, language and communication and psychological development and health and well-being of a person in terms of their psychological well-being. It's just a massively complex interplay of socioeconomic needs and culture and what's, all those things that influence all those little decisions that have happened and what choices are open to people and what choices are open to them even now when I'm working with people that are in their 20s who feel like their options are massively reduced going forward, and that they're kind of set on a path that can't be changed, and they're probably correct, but I find it really hard to accept it as a person who wants everyone to have their happily ever after.
And do you think speech, language and communication needs are causative in terms of offending, or might there be a marker of something else that's going on at the same time? I guess the answer could be both, is it?
It is both, but when you think the most common form of offending in gentlemen is violent offending, and you kind of, if you're thinking about that as a sort of cognitive behaviour model, you're thinking about how a person manages their thoughts and feelings and actions, then obviously, if I'm frustrated with somebody, then I'm articulate enough to say, you are really frustrating me and this is what we're going to do differently right now. And I'm assertive enough to do it also. But when I think about people that perhaps have had these really difficult upbringings and that aren't assertive in a way that is non-violent, and that they're trying to assert themselves but it's coming over as aggressive and it's not being heard, then perhaps that then is where it overspills into violence. And I was talking to, if you're a person and you're born with a stammer, you're more likely to end up in prison than a person that that doesn't. And so that stammering is massively overrepresented in the prison population. And so I was talking to a gentleman that has a stammer, and I was asking him what his view was, and he was sort of saying, well, yeah, of course, when you're very young and people are teasing you, you're gonna start responding to that by hitting them or being violent or threatening, and you're trying to scare the person away because you're not sure if they're going to be accepting or if they're going to hurt your feelings. And perhaps also if you're in a classroom situation and it's too hard to cope with the situation, the learning's too hard or the vocabulary's too hard, you know that if you behave violently, you're going to get sent out. So it's an easy way to avoid a situation that really stresses you, and you don't have the support to cope with stress and you don't have the emotional regulation skills, then you're going to take the easy way, aren't you? It's a no-brainer. So I think there's definite interplays between competence around communicating and violence. I'm doing quite a lot of work around our care and separation unit, so what's known as the SEG in movies, and working with people that have ended up there through various reasons, and the number of them that have got an unnoticed communication impairment, and they need some adaptations and some support and some help to understand their own needs. And when they can understand their own needs better, then they can self-advocate better, which means that then they don't have to become overly assertive to the point of aggression. So, even just helping people pick the time that they're going to ask an officer to do something. Because if you pick the wrong time and that other person's busy, they're going to say no to you. That doesn't mean that things need to get out of hand and everyone needs to start, doing something destructive. It means that you have to think about the other person's needs and the other person's demands and just being a little bit more sophisticated. And it's so obvious to you and I, but it really is not obvious to a person who's had a chaotic life experience.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. The other thing I really want to talk about as well is people that have got indeterminate sentences for public protection. And people with IPP sentences are hugely overrepresented on my caseload. And I don't know if that's because when they were arrested and interviewed and when they went to court, they were less able to explain themselves. So they looked more dodgy and attracted that sentence because they looked dangerous. That's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is actually has the long time that they've spent in prison eroded their communication skills, so now they look less able to manage themselves. And it's impossible to know, but I have huge questions around IPP sentences and around the needs of those people at different times.
It's a really interesting question, because as you were talking, I was just kind of like going over in my mind people that I'd encountered on IPPs, and probably a lot of them would have been people who would have benefited from seeing a speech and language therapist. And I think quite often using relatively small scale violence to resolve problems and disputes, but obviously in a way that was damaging, destructive of property, for instance, being a common feature of presentation, where somebody else might perhaps have articulated their frustration differently.
Very much so, yeah. And when we first opened, I had the luxury of a little bit of time within my day to do a little bit of sampling of patients, and so I met with patients that were going to go onto the forensic psychology course that was being run at the time. And so I met them just the once and asked them very nicely if they would do a formal assessment with me that would look at how well they understand grammar and what level of vocabulary they're at. So really just two very basic things. And these two assessments are both are designed for children, because there isn't an adult version for adults, because there's an expectation that once you've reached a certain age, you've got these skills. And every single person that I assessed was at a level lower than their chronological age. So in terms of their grammar, most of them were functioning around the level of just going to secondary school, so that 11, 12, 13. And in terms of vocabulary, there wasn't a single person that was functioning above primary school level vocabulary. So they would understand a word like hug, but wouldn't necessarily understand embrace. So there's some real thoughts there about the fact that when we go to study to be professionals, and when we're on placement and when we're learning our trade, we're encouraged to talk in very sophisticated vocabulary. And actually, do we need to remember to switch that off and talk in very accessible vocabulary? When you sort of think, okay, if they're functioning at the level of a primary school age child, would I speak to a 9-year-old using this kind of vocabulary? And there's something about finding that sort of pitch in the middle of the road where you're treating them as adults and you're treating them with compassion and dignity and giving them the respect that they should afford as adults, but you're also making that accessible and easy to engage with, because otherwise they're not going to tell you as a professional, particularly if they don't know you that well, and particularly if you're in a position of power, they're not going to tell you that they've not understood maybe one word in a sentence that was fundamental to understanding that sentence.
I think that's a really good point, and I also think there's a real skill in being able to communicate as a professional, in that to communicate quite sophisticated concepts, but in a way that make them easily accessible to other people.
Mm-hmm. I was chatting to a gentleman only this last week, and he had been given a piece of paper that had some information about him on, and the word extreme was used in one sentence. And he had understood that to mean that somebody thought that he was involved in extremist terrorism. And sitting with him, and I got out some post-it notes, and we wrote down different things that extreme could mean, and we stuck them on the table, and we kind of explored the word extreme, and then looked at his sentence again to take him on a little bit of a journey to try and decide which definition of extreme was meant, and we got there. There's absolutely no point in me telling him, don't be silly, extreme means this in this scenario. I have to take him on a guided journey, give him the information and help him make a decision about what that piece of paper might mean for him. Because otherwise he's not going to take it on board. It's not going to soak in. It needs to be supported. And when I started writing on post-it notes, he was like, "You don't have to do it this way. You can just tell me." And I was like, no, I need it so that I can remember the ones I've told you, and that it will help me think. And actually, the writing on the post-it notes slows it all down so that he's got more processing time. And after we'd talked, I sort of said, I'll put these post-it notes in the bin. And he was like, "No, I'm going to take them with me." And he took them with him so that he could reflect on it later. And there we go. I feel like, again, it's something that if you didn't do the post-it notes, he wouldn't have asked for it. But actually, it's an extra little bit of scaffold for him to take away with him and reflect on what these words might mean, and why he reached a decision he reached in that moment.
It sounds, Jacqui, like you're saying that speech and language therapy could also play a huge role in terms of impacting on people's ability to benefit from other kinds of interventions that are there in the system that are aimed at reducing their risk.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. I'm really lucky. I have really, really lovely relationships with colleagues across the board. So I do sit with people when they're hearing about their OASIS report with their offender manager. I might draw on a piece of paper a pause button, and we hit the pause button that's on the piece of paper as and when the person feels like they might need to stop and ask a question, or as I'm watching that person and wondering how they're coping, and I might press the pause button and say, "Let's have a little check-in here," and because it's tough stuff to listen to, isn't it? So around that, I go also to people's parole boards and support with understanding what will happen, understanding what is being asked, explaining what you want to tell the parole board. People often go in feeling like they need to articulate themselves in a very sophisticated way so that they're on an equal footing with the judge, but then they misuse some vocabulary, and then they've actually said something they didn't mean to say. So kind of building up that self-esteem and courage to actually speak in plain English, and perhaps even speaking to the parole board panel about speaking in plain English so that it feels like a level playing field. I'm more than happy to roll up my sleeves and interfere with the parole board slightly when they're looking at those things. The same again with like MAPA meetings and probation and license conditions. License conditions are broadly completely hard to understand for most people. There's a lot to remember. The vocabulary isn't easy. So I will actually sit and make an easy read version of the license conditions for them to have alongside the real official version. And that might even just translate to putting a few little key reminders, key triggers on a little key ring, so that they've got a key ring in their pocket that's going to remind them of something that they need to hang on to. So those people that have failed and been recalled multiple times for breaching their license conditions, my first question is, well, did they understand their license conditions, or was it too much to remember? I try and work really hard with colleagues around writing accessible reports. So our forensic psychology team have done some amazing work writing accessible risk assessments for people. And it's just wonderful. It's got to be so much better to engage with a piece of paper that you understand and that you get on with and that you feel comfortable with, rather than a report that's 50 pages long and just it feels painful in every other chapter, every other paragraph. So there's a range of things. I don't know if you've ever heard of talking mats. I would love to tell you that I invented talking mats, but I didn't. They were invented by an amazing speech therapist in Scotland. But a talking mat is a way to have a semi-structured interview with a person that's based on using some symbols and organising them on a doormat. And so I've got colleagues that are having conversations about risk with people using a talking mat, and it just changes the dynamic, and you can just get so much more information, and it's really very pleasing.
Thank you. I think you've given some beautiful vignettes of the detailed and painstaking work that you do with individuals there. It's been very impressive. So we've mainly been talking about your work in prisons, but do you think there are other areas of the custody system, the prison system, the criminal justice system that these kind of speech and language and communication needs might affect and have an impact on?
Very much so. So I'm really fortunate. I've got a really good network of colleagues across the UK that are working in liaison and diversion. So they're within the police custody suites, trying to identify people that need extra help early on and trying to make sure that that help is in place. There's people that are working as intermediaries within the court systems to help people engage with and participate in their criminal justice pathway. So there are speech and language therapists at different points within the journey. There's always scope for more, isn't there? So I meet people that I identify their needs, and nobody had identified their needs previously. There's something of a postcode lottery going on, that if you happen to be arrested in a location that has a speech and language therapist in their diversion team, then that's great. If there's somebody advocating for you and explaining your needs at court level, perhaps you might attract a hospital order rather than a custodial sentence. Perhaps you might also be given support to be within the community in a least restrictive way. So there's kind of various points where perhaps if there was better recognition of these hidden impairments, a different outcome would happen. But all we can do is keep banging the drum and keep talking about it and sharing what we're doing and try to educate people.
Right, so still areas for development.
Very much so.
Good. So finally, you've chosen, as you told us, to work in forensic practice in prisons. How do you look after yourself? How do you keep yourself emotionally nourished and healthy when you're working within a setting which is really quite challenging and can be quite, very difficult to work in? How do you look after yourself?
I'm really lucky because I work in a team where there's a lot of really on-the-spot close support. So there's opportunities to debrief right away. If there's a person that you're worried about seeing and you would like somebody with you, there's always people around, so that if you wanted to work jointly, if there's a really complex case and you want to share care coordination with somebody, there's colleagues. The person will usually be open to more than one service, so there's always somebody that you can peer work with. I'm really fortunate in the amount of support and supervision that's in place for me in a formal sense. So I have support and supervision within speech and language therapy in the forensic settings from colleagues that live in other geographical areas. But I have support and supervision within the prison from colleagues that work there, that maybe they're not speech and language therapists, but they understand the demands and challenges. I have local clinical supervision to ensure that I'm following local pathways appropriately. So there's a lot of support out there, and I think it's just that I'm just incredibly lucky with that. There's a lot of interest in speech and language therapy in a forensic setting, and so there's a lot of people that want to help and see it be successful, because we're investing in hopefully future services. If we can prove it works, and we can prove that we can keep our speech therapists well while they're working in these difficult environments, that's only going to benefit everybody, isn't it? So I'm very lucky. I've got lots of support. I would have to say, when you ask me what nourishes me, it's mostly the patients. So when I've got a man who perhaps has a reputation of being, a bit scary and a bit shouty and a bit unpleasant, and he says to me, "Oh, I heard your voice in my head and I didn't do it," then that's all good for me. That is the warm glow factor that I need. And then I've got quite a few men that have left the prison with very, very complex releases, and I've done lots of work to ensure the robustness of their release and the support around them. And occasionally they'll drop me a letter, or they'll be in touch, and they're doing all right. And so that's just fab. One of my gentlemen, who is IPP and has been in a really long time, and I had supported around his parole board and his progression, just sent me a photograph of his kitchen, and that's just amazing, because this is a chap who didn't ever think he would have a kitchen, and it, it's just a kitchen, but it's not just a kitchen. Actually, it's representative of getting a lot of things back on track after you've been inside for a really long time. So that, I can handle pictures of kitchens every day. That would be amazing.
That's a great answer. Thanks very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you. It's so good to talk with you today, Jacqui. Really nice to hear somebody so passionate about the work.
Thank you very much for having me.
Every week when we have these conversations, I think I was so lucky to meet with so many people who are really passionate about their work, and I've got a real sense of positivity about work that they're doing in really quite challenging circumstances. And that was certainly another conversation like that today, I think. And it was really nice to hear about somebody working in a prison where there was this really strong ethos that was where they're actively trying to be something that more resembled a Scandinavian model of working.
Yeah, I thought Jacqui was very good, very clear at putting across what a speech and language therapist actually does, and how they do that within a criminal justice setting, and I think that was very impressive. And then at the end, when we asked her how she looked after herself, she came up with just the right kind of things, I thought. Being embedded in a supportive multidisciplinary team, 1, 2, having good supervision, and 3, enjoying working with her clients. Many thanks again to all of you who have listened to our Locked Up Living podcast. Feel free to mention this to your friends and to your colleagues, and give us feedback on our webpage lockeduplives.com and our Twitter account Locked Up Living. Many thanks too to Pete and Rach, who kindly allowed us to use their music. You Have Called Me Courage, and this is available from all the usual outlets.